Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I see so many old friends from so many different aspects of my career. This book has a very wide scope, 42 memoirs of direct participants and victims of the ZhiQing sent-down program, indoctrination, re-education, that Mao developed perhaps to cultivate revolutionary successors so that there would be a cadre to carry on his vision. This is something that Ai Weiwei talks about on this book that he has published. He writes, the sent-down program destroyed rationality and severed people's historical memory. So we'll also address what motivated Mao and other Chinese revolutionary leaders to pursue waves of attacks and campaigns of prosecution of intellectuals, experts, and even young students, as in this case, to the severe detriment of economic advancement of China. And how does this material in this book aid us in understanding the nature of the revolution, its core ideology, Marxism, Leninism, democratic centralism, anti-revisionism in Chinese revolutionary history of thought. These are stories of young people being exiled from their families, losing the freedom to pursue their education and career development, and being indoctrinated in the politics of class struggle and social division. So how could a rebellion and a hunger strike of young people that occurred in Yunnan that I just referred to succeed in influencing the government to make a drastic change in state policy early 1979, when exactly 10 and a half years later, June 1989, young educated people were shot down for peaceably protesting in Tiananmen Square. First, let me describe this book. During a span of 17 years, 62 to 79, close to 18 million Chinese educated youth, about one half of an entire generation of literate teenagers from China's cities, were sent off to remote places in the Chinese countryside, sometimes for a decade or more, to be, quote, re-educated, to learn from the peasant. These millions of kids who were the subject of this massive program of social engineering are known as ZhiQing, educated youth literally. Because they were literate middle and high school graduates from Chinese cities, they were educated. They're also known as sent-down youth. Well, the Red Guard episode in China's Cultural Revolution is, of course, better known to Westerners. The ZhiQing experience was far more impactful for China historically. It shaped the lives, thought, and behavior of an entire generation of Chinese, including China's current president, Xi Jinping. He was a ZhiQing, privileged, unlike others, because his father was then vice premier, and he was one of the few allowed to take a holiday from the ZhiQing experience. But he made very good use of his experience to develop his network of connections with the cadres in the area he was sent down to, in Yunnan actually, and built his career foundation from that experience, which he celebrates in his own official biography as a demographic phenomenon. The ZhiQing program has been characterized as the largest compulsory population shift in human history, quoting scholars and critics. The program was really not carried out to reverse the usual tide of population movement from poor rural places to urban areas, which is typical of developing countries. This was, however, the thesis of the first book to address the ZhiQing movement, a book published by Professor Thomas Bernstein of Columbia University in 1977, before there was any access to do research on the ground in China. He wrote this book really based upon government sources, a small group of refugees. But his book, called Up to the Mountains and Down to the Villages, the transfer of youth from urban to rural China, recognized as a legitimate commentary on current Chinese circumstances. In fact, there was quite a distortion because this was not an intentional program of shifting population for development purposes. It was driven by ideology. According to the scholars of the history, principally Michel Bonin, who wrote a book on the rustication of Chinese youth, and I recruited to write the foreword to this book. Though the motivations for the program evolved with circumstances on the ground over time, it was carried out mainly to fulfill an ideological obsession of Mao Zedong, namely to convert city kids who, in his view, were ideologically corrupted by conventional knowledge and distracted by material advantage into passionate revolutionary successors of Mao himself and other founders of the Chinese Revolution. That was the main and constant purpose of the ZhiQing movement. By witnessing and experiencing a class struggle from the perspective of the peasants, the sent-down youth would be equipped to carry on the permanent revolution that Mao believed was necessary for his revolution to be sustained and to achieve its utopian goals. The history of the ZhiQing episode has previously well presented by Professor Bonin. Professor Bonin's book, called The Lost Generation and subtitled The Rustication of China's Educated Youth, was first published in 2004 in both French and English, and later republished with Chinese government acceptance in 2013 in Chinese in both Hong Kong and in Beijing. Very unusual. Our book project was Wang Youfen's effort to present the ZhiQing experience through the presentation of a representative selection of 42 of the best short first-hand accounts available from literally thousands of published memoirs and stories that Youfen examined. In the early 90s, following the Tiananmen incident, tensions were very high in China. Chinese government determined to allow steam to be let off for those who had suffered the ZhiQing experience to vent in local publications. So there was an outpouring for this wedge of freedom of expression of memoirs published by local party-controlled, government-controlled publications, which mostly no longer exist. They found expression in written and in online early form. Now, Youfen was driven to undertake this project by the conviction that the world needed to know about this large-scale deportation in China, which, although not as deadly as the gulags of the Soviet Union or the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, and he made these explicit parallelisms, but analogies, that they disrupted the lives and had a lifelong impact on a whole generation of Chinese urban youth. Now, these kids who were forced en masse to live potentially forever, far away from home, generally dejected, rural places, suffered all sorts of hardships and injustices in the name of receiving re-education so they could carry on continuous revolution. After Mao's death, the regime abandoned the ZhiQing policy, but many of those who managed to return home and the minority who were forced to stay in the countryside are still struggling to survive lost opportunity and displacement they suffered in their educational and career development and in their minds. Now, the book brings together a collection of 42 memoirs, stories that are organized into 5 topical and chronological groupings: life and work, relationship with local people, love, marriage, and family, the Go Home campaign, confessions and reflections of participants. Each of these short works was selected because it revealed a distinctive aspect of the ZhiQing experience. Wang Youfen and I worked together to select the best and revise them through exhaustive polish editing so that each story works as a literary short story or as credible reportage and would deliver maximum emotional impacts that have been shaped by the editors, yours truly, and Wang Youfen, very prominent, highly experienced editors of literature who have participated in this project will remain anonymous because the families are concerned of the reaction of the Chinese government to their involvement. Now, Youfen's insights as a world-class translator and editor obviously amplified the results because he had directly experienced political struggle and physical exile himself, firsthand. As a writer, editor, and publisher, as an educated intellectual, his adult life and career paralleled directly the arc and episodes of revolutionary Chinese history experienced particularly by intellectuals. This book, his life's final project, into which he invested his experience and wisdom, is a legacy of his contributions to understanding China's revolution and regime and our own times and challenges. And I was happy to bring it to publication. It took an extra 6 years since he left us, but the work was substantially complete in a manuscript. So Youfen, his life really parallels the episodes of the arc of Chinese revolutionary history. He was born on July 5th, 1927, and passed away on March 2nd, 2018. He was born and grew up in Wuhan, China. When he was 10 years old, the Japanese army besieged Wuhan in a major battle, June 1938. The Wang family picked up and fled by boat and on foot to Sichuan province from Wuhan. Along the way in Chongqing, Sichuan, his father contracted cholera and died. Youfen settled with his mother and family in Chengdu. He remembered as a child selling some of the family heirlooms in front of the Taoist temple in Chengdu in order to buy food. In 1945, after Japan surrendered, Youfen was accepted with a full scholarship as a college student at Nanking University in the Agricultural Economics Department, which he selected because the record of sending more students overseas than any other in China. He was the leading student in English, which he mastered as a writer, as an editor, even though he had no experience living overseas in an English-speaking country. In fact, he was one of the top students in the university and was elected to be the student body president of Nanking University in 1948. In that capacity, he spoke out about the official corruption of the nationalist government and was soon approached by the underground Communist Party and solicited to join. In 1948, he helped organize a student protest in Nanjing that called for an immediate end to the war with the communists. In December of that year, he was arrested and jailed, but was released from prison a few months later as part of an amnesty declared by Li Zhongren, who was then Chiang Kai-shek's successor as acting president of the nationalist government. After his release, Youfen, 21 years old, went underground back to his hometown of Wuhan, where he worked in various local Communist Party roles. Following the founding of the PRC on October 1st, 1949, Youfen received intensive training in English and journalism, and at 22 years of age, he joined the International Press Bureau of the PRC in Beijing as one of the first recruits for English language communications. Identified professionally as an expert and an intellectual, Youfen was a beneficiary and a victim of that identity in a regime led by Mao Zedong, who disparaged and stigmatized intellectuals and idealized his own personal model of education at the, quote, University of the Green Woods. Reference was to the forest haunts of bandits and revolutionary guerrilla fighters. That's where he thought was the place to learn your stuff rather than at conventional educational institutions. In 1957, so-called 100 Flowers movement occurred. The government encouraged initially for intellectuals to speak out. Youfen was one of them who took the bait and spoke out critically against the Communist Party. He was then, like many others, accused of being a rightist, was demoted from his Communist Party membership status, put under probation, I should say, by the party. 1958-60, Youfen was brought back as a reporter and editor of the newly formed English language weekly news magazine of the PRC, the Beijing Review, that was modeled on Time magazine. He also became head of all English publications at the Foreign Languages Press of the PRC. In 1968, at the height of the Cultural Revolution, Youfen was accused of being a capitalist rover and a spy for Chiang Kai-shek. He was publicly humiliated. He told me personally of how his young subordinates had taken over the office of the Foreign Languages Press and had forced him and other senior officials to sweep the floors and clean the toilets. He painfully recollected that nobody ever apologized for this cruel, unfair treatment. The subject was never discussed. In 1969, he and his family were expelled from Beijing and sent down to a small village on the banks of the Yellow River in Yunnan province, village of New Wei. Purpose was to be re-educated by the peasants. They lived in a mud hut and learned how to farm and raise chickens for 2.5 years in exile. The daughter, I think, was then working in a factory, but the son, 10-year-old Peter, was with him. To keep warm in the winter, he and 10-year-old Peter were forced to walk 30 miles to load half ton of coal onto a sledge and to pull it back to their hut so they had fuel for heating. In 1972, Youfen was called back to Beijing to resume his work at the Beijing Review as deputy chief editor. In 1984, he was a senior member of a delegation to the U.S. official delegation of the party secretary, Zhao Ziyang. During that visit in 1984, he interviewed Henry Kissinger and Brzezinski for the Beijing Review. So he was, at the top of the heap of official Chinese journalism. In 1986, he came back to New York to set up the Beijing Review office in New York, and that's when I first met him, and we struck up a friendship. As I mentioned, in May '89, I met him, stayed with him in Beijing, and witnessed the first student worker demonstration, which really shocked him. After the Tiananmen Square crackdown, because he had published in the Beijing Review 2 editorials favoring the Zhao Ziyang democracy movement policies, he was persecuted again, stripped of his positions and party membership, and forced into early retirement. Starting in 1990, 40 years, rising to the very top of the official communications function in English for the government. Next 28 years until he passed away in 2018 at age 90. He spent those years as a freelance journalist, editor, translator, and publisher. Called this period of his life the best time of his life. And he operated as a under-the-radar dissident intellectual whose agenda was to educate his fellow citizens in principles of civil society, democracy, freedom of thought, expose English speakers and the rest of the world to values of Chinese culture. In 1992, on his own initiative, Bill Clinton was running for president, and Youfen translated Jim Moore's Clinton biography into Chinese and published it, called Clinton, Young Man in a Hurry. At that time, he was living and working in my empty house in Park Slope, Brooklyn. The following year, he translated and published another bestseller, Mark Perry's The Last Day of the CIA. There was a lot of popular interest in China about the contest of US and Soviet spying. He anonymously translated an essay by the famous Chinese playwright Xia Yetqin, which I was able to get published in Harper's Magazine, without his name associated. In 2003, chief editor of the Yale University Press project on a multi-volume study of the culture and civilization of China, approached Youfen to assist with a volume on calligraphy. These were volumes written by the lead scholars of the various categories of Chinese art and culture, in this case, calligraphy. But the project foundered because the Chinese scholars had written essays that were untranslatable into any language because they were so arcane and technical. So Youfen volunteered to try to save the project by helping the scholars to write accessible essays. To succeed in that effort, he had to learn an entirely new language, namely the arcane metaphorical language of Chinese calligraphy criticism. Yale Press appreciated his skill and zeal and named him chief translator and editor of that volume. And in 2008, the Association of American Publishers awarded first prize to that book, Calligraphy, as the best book of both the humanities and art history categories in their annual prize giving. So his skills were really astonishing. In 2011, at age 84, Youfen launched with friends in Beijing a new publishing house and imprint called New Knowledge Cross-Culture Media Company. And the imprint of this book is New Knowledge Press, in recognition of that legacy. In early 2016, he was approached to join a project about ZhiQing, a documentary film project, became intrigued with the subject, and he made contact with a group of ZhiQing veterans living in Chengdu, led by a man named Yefeng. Yefeng had written a memoir about his own extraordinary experience as a sent-down youth on an industrial farm in Yunnan. And this story, which is in the book, entitled Solidarity Brings Us Home. It's an extraordinary story, particularly reflecting on what happened 10 and a half years later in the massacre at Tiananmen of young students. In late December 78 through early January 79, Yefeng had served as the organizer and leader of a strike of ZhiQing at a paramilitary industrial farm in Yunnan. At that time, over 100,000 ZhiQing had been living and working in exile in the semi-tropics of Yunnan in southwest China, planting and tending rubber trees. Yefeng was working with 5,000 other male and female ZhiQing at a place called Mengding Farm near the border with Myanmar. He had been there for 10 years when on December 23rd, 78, all 5,000 ZhiQing working on the farm were called together for a special official announcement at 8 p.m. that evening. At this special meeting, the group was informed that the national government had just issued a policy decision affecting all ZhiQing in the country who were still working and living in exile. Henceforth, they would no longer be classified as ZhiQing, but would thereafter become farm employees in Yunnan for the rest of their lives. Their dreams of returning home to Chengdu were suddenly shattered, and the farm was immediately enveloped in an uproar of shouted exclamations. Quote, "We have been here for 8 years. Even the war against Japan ended after 8 years. As veterans, we should be demobilized and sent home. Give back our urban residency. Give back our youth. We'll fight to the death to go home." They claimed that they had been tricked by lying recruiters to go there in the first place. And instead of the promised paradise, they had lived in squalor, been mistreated, the females often sexually abused. Everyone nearly worked and starved to death, and now they were told that they would endure this exile for the rest of their lives. Yefeng found himself selected to be the leader of the protesters. Some of the group proposed writing a petition to the Beijing authorities. Others proposed sending a delegation to Beijing. Yefeng took out a copy of the PRC Constitution, and he read aloud the provision on the rights of citizens to demonstrate and strike. Give back our urban residency. Workers on nearby farms were recruited to the cause and mobilized into a general committee for strike and petition. Large rallies were held. By January 5th, 79, thousands of ZhiQing had streamed by foot from up to 20 miles away, gathered at Mengding Farm. The next day, a first batch of 201 male hunger strikers were selected from hundreds of volunteers. Local officials tried to defame Yefeng and derail this movement on trumped up charges that he had stolen something at a hotel. But that was defeated. The students were clever. They were able to deal with these efforts to derail. One ZhiQing member of the group had previously served in the People's Liberation Army Signal Corps, and he had the number to the switchboard of the State Council in Beijing, which he dialed up. And he was able to reach someone at the general office of the State Council in Beijing. The initial response was to accuse the strikers of sedition, but gradually the tone changed to alarm about the potential escalation of the hunger strike and the spread of news of it across the country. Within a few days, the State Council dispatched a famous veteran general from the Long March, Zhou Fan. They dispatched him to try to head off this trouble. He was then the Vice Minister of Agriculture and the Deputy Head of the ZhiQing Affairs Bureau of the government, and he was also the father of 4 sent-down youth When Youfen repeated the official line, the crowd shouted back its slogans. Again, we want to go home. Give back our urban residency right now. Give back our youth. We will fight to the death to go home. Suddenly, as described in the memoir, a female ZhiQing threw herself on the ground in front of the old general and started wailing, and the crowd joined in. Even Youfen sobbed loudly over the microphone, his tears spilling down his cheeks. Whoa. ZhiQing, he said, as recorded in this story. ZhiQing comrades, he said, I have 3 sons working as ZhiQing and a daughter in a factory. As a ZhiQing parent, I understand and sympathize with you. Your demands are legitimate. Your wish can be realized. Youfen then spent another day gathering information about the ZhiQing experience in the region and returned to Beijing. About a week later, a decision was approved by the State Council to greatly relax and substantially reverse the initial policy that allowed now ZhiQing to go home to their home cities. Back to the city wind swept the whole of China at the end of the 1970s. In retrospect, this was no time in Chinese modern history to allow an escalation of a domestic uprising. One explanation of why things were so different in this situation than 10 and a half years later. The geopolitical context was fraught for China. January 1, 1979, which coincided with this uprising, was the date scheduled to commence normal diplomatic relations with the U.S. that China had worked so hard to bring about, and to open trade and investment activities with the U.S. In fact, U.S. diplomats were then visiting Kunming, the capital of Yunnan province. At the same time, tensions between Vietnam and China were escalating on the Vietnam border, not far from Ningding Industrial Farm. So it was a very critical moment. One of the most popular stories, which leads off the book, is the story called The Song of the ZhiQing and the Death of the Composer. It's well known to many Chinese who have not read this book. The composer of this song, Ren Yi, was from Nanjing. And in 1969, during the Cultural Revolution, he was living on a rural village of the ZhiQing, and he composed a nice folk song for his friends. Here's what he wrote. White clouds soaring in the blue sky. The ancient lovely city of Nanjing nestles by the side of the beautiful Yangtze. There I was born and brought up. Oh, the great rainbow-like bridge thrusts at the clouds to reach the other side of the Yangtze River. Mount Zhong, magnificent and mighty, lies near my hometown like a crouching tiger. I said goodbye to Mom, bidding farewell to my hometown. The golden times of my school days are all gone, leaving only a paper album from my youth. Ah, the road that lies ahead is so rugged and so long. I leave my footprints, both deep and shallow, on remote alien lands. Rising with the sun and coming back with the moon, I undertake the heavy job of repairing the globe. Fulfilling this glorious sacred duty now turns out to be my fate. To summarize the rest of the story, the song is somehow picked up by the Russian authorities. China is then in tension with Russia, actually. And one of the military choruses of Russia picks up this song, as kind of a propaganda. And they broadcast it so that it is heard, kind of humiliates the Chinese government regarding this program. Even though Ren Yi, the composer, hears about this, he goes to the police station. He turns himself in. They say, what's the big deal? You composed a song, go home. Well, it's in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, spread across China, and in Shanghai, the authorities don't like the sentiment that is conveyed by this song. So Ren Yi is arrested. He's convicted of crimes against the state and sentenced to death. It's only on appeal that an official determines to commute his sentence to 10 years in prison. It takes 9 years in prison for him to get out for his sentence commuted. Of course, the commentary about the madness of the Cultural Revolution. They thought is sentimental and regretful for his service, cast the ZhiQing program in a negative light, and Mao's wife, Jiang Qing herself, took this up as a cause to go after the poser of this story. So let me end here and open things up for questions and comments.
Thank you, Professor Radin, for your presentation. I was very interested. I'm ZhiQing myself. Just like here, fair amount of my fellow students and people went to the countryside, to Shaoxing, Xiaxia,
Yes.
and I know their views. I know our story, and I wanted to see a Western's view, a Western scholar's view. How do you get to the root cause of this movement? My question is, social media and my friends, and it's not in the minority. They say, 青春无悔, we never regret our youthful years. And how this could be so deeply rooted, and even now, and they said that there is no regret. Well, you lost your education, and some lost their life. Some friends actually they died, and I asked them, to ask our friend on the pedestal if she is still alive. She wants to live now, or she wants to be a hero on the pedestal. They said, we don't want to stay with her.
Yeah.
So how do you understand this? We don't want to regret our youth.
That's a catchphrase employed to rationalize that experience, to put it behind the issue which we share in this country is, whether we have the freedom to express our true feelings about our experience. These memoirs would not be allowed to be published today. This was, a window of freedom that was limited to this kind of subject matter because it wasn't controversial at that moment, didn't relate to the sensitivity of Tiananmen. It was something in the past, and the state permitted this temporary ventilation, whatever legacy, emotions, because it wasn't current or controversial. As you'll see from the stories, there's a whole range of experiences. Not all of them are negative. Two of the writers successfully immigrated to this country. One is a retired professor of Chinese cinema. He was invited to my talk, which I gave about this at Chautauqua last August. He couldn't attend because he was having a knee operation or something. He's had a very successful career as an academic here, and the other author also has retired in comfort. But there's a lot of people who were permanently damaged because they were derailed from their generational opportunity for education and for career development. And they were wounded psychologically. The phrase that you use tells a lot about how people are conditioned to rationalize their experience, or they avoid politics. That's very interesting. Yeah, please. Yeah.
When I was adjunct professor at Stony Brook, one of my students was from his parents. Both of his parents were sent down, and so they missed their entire period of education, and they were incredibly bitter. Somehow found their way to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong to the Bronx, and so they put incredible pressure on him in his own career, in his own education, to make up for their loss. It was a very oppressive situation. As he was telling me the story, that he actually started crying about the humiliation he faced at his parents. So the psychological aspect and ripple effects referred to were really quite harsh. My question is, how are they treated by the peasants in the communities to which they were sent?
Yeah, very good point. But the first point is really taken up by a study by Evan Osners in the New Yorker about Chinese students.
Peter Hersner.
Oh yeah, excellent essay in the New Yorker about Chinese students and this psychology of pressure to perform, which inevitably is influenced by experience of their parents. And Ai Weiwei writes about that it led to cultural poverty for several generations, destroyed nationality, severed people's historical memory and rational thinking, deeply affected the way Chinese people think and behave today. And of course, he was exiled with his father, and writes about that in his recent autobiography, Contributions. I'm sure you saw right here how the peasants felt having these aliens thrust into their communities and literally taking food out of their mouths, because we're talking about subsistence economy, agricultural economies where they were barely raising enough food to feed themselves, and then they had to provide for these ZhiQing. There were serious tensions. On the other hand, you have stories expose the empathetic human nature of the local people. One of them, which is very moving, is a story written by one of the people I mentioned who has had a happy emigration and career in the U.S. And he was sent to Inner Mongolia to a sheep herding community, lived in gears, yurts. The young people were utterly clueless. They had no idea how to survive. They didn't know how to set up their gear. They didn't know how to collect the fuel to keep them warm, namely dry dung. They knew nothing. In this story, they were helped by a woman who was stigmatized, as a bad element. So they were conditioned, not to deal with her, even though she saved their lives over and over again. And the import of the story is that the regret, because the woman who passed away before the writer came back to express his thanks, and his lifelong regret. The ideology had conditioned people, these young people, to lose their humanity, to categorize people on the basis of their political categorization by the party that was indoctrinated into them, and how that distorted human relations, and what a sad thing. We need to learn from that. We have our own polarization that dehumanizes and damages our human instincts.
And thank you everyone for coming to the great day.